Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains a little odd. And today, we're going to discuss a much requested locomotive manufacturer. Yes, of course, I am talking about Lima Locomotive Works. Going back to my initial video on Alco, a lot of people, and I mean a lot of people, were super upset that I didn't even mention them, to the point that I made absolutely certain to mention it in my Baldwin video, cause, wow, guys, I honestly didn't know how much y'all really needed me to talk about Lima. But let's do it now. This is the history and the fall of Lima Locomotive Works. Lima Locomotive Works, like Baldwin and unlike Alco, actually started its history as a machine works shop. They did not initially make locomotives. They were founded in 1869 and focused on constructing equipment for farms and sawmills. They were named for their location in Lima, Ohio, and even though they weren't making locomotives back then, much of the sawmill equipment specifically was powered by steam engines, so they did already have some experience with the technology. Those product lines also meant that they were well established in the logging industry, which would become super relevant later. By 1873, they had sold over 40 sawmills, and by 1879, the product offerings actually included traction engines, but not quite rail-based locomotives yet. Around that same time, a man by the name of Ephraim Shay had designed his own steam locomotive that lumber companies actually really enjoyed because it was really good at hauling heavy loads and operating on really rough rails. The locomotive type that would become known as simply the Shay was a geared steam locomotive. Geared locomotives are consistently not very fast, but have tremendous tractive effort, making them extremely good for rural areas, particularly in the logging industry. Loggers are not track layers, and conventional locomotives had a habit of just kind of falling off rough track. Shays could handle rougher track a lot better, and even if they did derail, they were actually pretty easy to re-rail, at least when compared to a more conventional locomotive. Lumberman James Alley saw the locomotive type as a solution to many of these issues, with transporting heavy loads of lumber from logging sites to sawmills and merchants. So in 1878, Alley contracted with Lima to build the Shay. Ephraim Shay agreed to license his design to Lima, and he himself purchased 64 shares of the company for $100 each. He also received a royalty on every single Shay that was built. The royalty was calculated as the percentage of the final product's weight. The early locomotives they were building were around 7 tons, but Lima saw a significant benefit to this business model. The Shays were popular, and people were buying them. They already had really good relationships with plenty of logging companies anyway, and that meant they wanted to buy from Lima because they made good products, and the Shays were no exception. Lima-built Shays were a little bit different than Ephraim's original design, partially to improve their performance and partially to make them more suitable for mass production. For example, drive shafts and gears replaced the original leather belt that Ephraim had used. Some people actually call this a Carnes design, named after John Carnes, who was an engineer at Lima, who had been instrumental in redeveloping the Shay. His contributions to the new design used slip joints, universal joints, and bevel gears on a longitudinally oriented shaft that turned crown gears bolted to the wheels. Those elements remained with Lima's Shays until the end of production around 1945. That's how long they were building these things. In 1880 and 1881, they produced 4 Shays each year, but by 1882, the number increased to 26. Steam locomotives became Lima's principal product, so they changed their name to Lima Locomotive and Machine Works, LLMW. Later on in 1912, they would become Lima Locomotive Corporation, and then again in 1916 to simply Lima Locomotive Works, which is generally how most people know them. Now, Lima was never ever as big as Alco or Baldwin. They were always in third place behind the other two. But what Lima lacked in the ability to beat out their competitors, they made up for in technical innovation. Their products were genuinely very good, solidly built, and usually offered unique attributes that the other competitors just didn't provide. Making geared steam locomotives like Shay's is one element of this, as it was a unique, niche locomotive that might not be very suitable for regular railway operation, but it was amazing for lumber and mining operations. During the early 1900s, they also began to dabble in more conventional steam locomotives in an effort to expand their business, which is a good call. This level of experimentation and expansion actually started because of a really bad thing that happened, as in the early 1900s, a massive fire actually heavily damaged their original shops. It was so bad that they simply built a new facility that was open in 1902. But the new facility was designed around the idea of constructing more conventional locomotives, because the demand for the lower speed geared locomotives was going down. They knew it wasn't sustainable, so they started to dabble in heavy railroad locomotives. They still built Shays, of course, but they were looking into other avenues. But even there, things were kinda weird for Lima, as their methodology was always, well, principally their own. In order to help the common person understand what the difference was between Lima and Baldwin and Alco, well, let's compare it to soda companies. That seems like a weird metaphor, but bear with me on this. With Baldwin, we have our classic Coke company. They were here first, they were the principal big boys in the industry, and people see them as generally quite reliable. That classic flavor, you know. Then you have Alco, newer on the block, but still very, very large, and a worthy competitor to Baldwin. They are Pepsi. Those two duke it out for the top spot, but back there in third place is a very small company that's just kicking around, yet somehow still selling a significant amount of products to consumers. Lima is Dr. Pepper. Independently owned still, not bought out by the other two, and while never holding as much of a market share as the others, still maintaining their own existence and producing a quality, if not odd, product, because let's be fair, Dr. Pepper doesn't taste like Pepsi or Coke. Their principal product is weirder than the others. Now, Dr. Pepper's parent company does make RC Cola, so they know how to make more normal things, shall we say. But my point is that Lima's principal products are often a lot odder than the more conventional stuff put out by Baldwin and Alco. And despite this, they were always in, well, third place, which is still pretty good. Like, yeah, you're in third in a market share, but that's still bronze medal. I mean, come on now, that's actually a pretty decent achievement, all things considered. Not that their market was ever that large to begin with, but Lima was appealing to a part of the market that Baldwin and Alco generally couldn't that easily, especially early on, which is the more rugged industrial operations. Whereas Baldwin and Alco focused on the larger railways, Lima didn't do that so much, at least not at first, but they would start to as the 1900s pushed on, especially into the 1920s, because, like I said, what Lima was really good at was technical innovations, and boy, howdy did they have one! The Berkshire. They introduced an interesting concept known as superpower, which was developed by Lima's mechanical engineer, William E. Woodard. Woodard made significant changes to maximize a conventional steam locomotive's capacity to generate and utilize steam. The modifications made the locomotives significantly more powerful and a lot faster. Lima was looking to unlock the potential of steam technology, and they did it. Starting in 1922 with the H-10, which was an experimental heavy 282 that was designed for New York Central. The H-10 would have been a Mikado at this point, they weren't quite at the Berkshires yet. He applied what was known as coal ratios, as well as every single efficiency-enhancing tool that he possibly could. A larger firebox, increased superheat, a feed water heater, improved drafting, higher boiler pressures, streamlined steam passages, and a trailing truck booster engine. He applied limited cutoff, which was the range of steam valve admission settings to prevent locomotive engineers from using excessive steam at starting. And the H10 showed that it was 26% more efficient overall than its immediate predecessor. New York Central was very impressed and bought 301 of these locomotives. Woodard wasn't done though. He wanted to improve on this basic design. So he added a large increase in firebox area, which necessitated adding another axle to the trailing truck, creating the 284 wheel arrangement. That is known as a Berkshire. Built in 1925, the new demonstrator was dubbed the A1. He was also able to add an ash pan due to the extra room the four-wheeled trailing truck allowed for. And because of that, the truck was actually redesigned as an articulated extension of the locomotive's frame. That meant the ash pan could hold a lot more ash and allowed the locomotive to travel farther between cleanings, another efficiency-enhancing method. But that wasn't without its compromises. The articulated frame actually reduced weight on the driving wheels, which didn't help with tractive effort at all. The locomotives configured this way also had more difficulty staying on the rails when going in reverse, particularly through the heavily switched areas of yards. But the benefits did really outweigh the downsides, because the new design was 26 to 30% more efficient than the New York Central H10s that they had just built. It was an even better superpower version. And by that I mean the A1 left Selkirk Yard nearly 50 minutes after the H10 had, and pulled a train that was over 600 tons heavier, and yet she arrived at North Adams Junction 10 minutes ahead of the H10. The superpower wasn't all a marketing stunt, it really was something that was genuinely good. And railroads began buying the Berkshires left and right because of how impressive their performance was. Woodard summed up the superpower concept by calling it horsepower at speed. Prior to this, design principles had actually emphasized tractive effort over speed, but the Berkshire was an effort to combine elements, making the locomotives go fast as well as being able to pull strongly. And the success actually happened in at least 3 different waves. And not every locomotive they built under the superpower label was necessarily a Berkshire. Some had more drivers, for example, but they all tended to have at least 4 trailers to necessitate the larger firebox. The first wave also included Missouri Pacific's 284s and Texas Pacific 210-4s. In 1927, the Erie Railroad took a delivery of a second phase Berkshire with 70-inch drivers. That same design actually would later evolve into the Chesapeake and Ohio T1s, which were 210-4s of 1930, and they had 69-inch drivers. And the third phase happened in the later 1930s, which is generally said to include locomotives like the C&O or Virginian 2666s, as well as the vast majority of 484s that were built. Boiler pressures began to rise as high as 310 pounds per square inch, which just a few decades prior would have been considered high pressure. But ʻlaɪmə had changed how steam locomotives were being built, and both Alco and Baldwin were paying attention and followed suit, creating locomotives of their own that could be identified as under the superpower concept, such as the Big Boy for Alco and Baldwin's Santa Fe 210-4s. In fact, the four-wheeled trailing truck became the standard for large locomotives, while the articulated mainframe didn't due to those derailing issues I mentioned before. Either way though, ʻlaɪmə had changed the game, but it was not to last, unfortunately. ʻlaɪmə could be described as a tinkerer, an innovator, an organization that completely changed how an industry was looking at their locomotives. They influenced the larger companies to adapt because the product that they were making was so good, and even though they were smaller, railroads still went to them for the quality stuff they provided. But they didn't suffer from complacency so much like Baldwin. ʻlaɪmə seemed to suffer more from tunnel vision. They were so focused on creating the next greatest steam locomotive that they completely ignored other avenues of locomotive technology. Baldwin at least had experience with electric locomotives, and Alco had some successful lines of diesels by this point. But by the early 1940s, ʻlaɪmə hadn't touched any other locomotive technology. They only focused on steam. They hadn't even given diesels a second look, or a first look for that matter. And this is a problem, because you know what's coming. The dieselization of America's railroad industry. That ʻlaɪmə was woefully unprepared for, and they actually started making really dumb mistakes even before that happened. See, when they delivered the first group of 2666s in 1941, Lima actually completely miscalculated the locomotive's weights. This is bad because Chesapeake and Ohio paid their maintenance crews based on the weight of the locomotives they were working on. When the maintenance crews recalculated the weight, they discovered that the H8s weighed thousands of pounds more than Lima had claimed. The crews felt that this was an intentional attack on their own livelihood and blamed their bosses, but C&O didn't do this on purpose. They had no idea that Lima had screwed up. And in order to make up for it, C&O had to pay their crews thousands of dollars, and they subsequently sued Lima for over $3 million in 1944. As World War II ended and profits began to dwindle, Lima didn't really make an effort to innovate or change much of what was going on. They still tinkered with steam, but they seem to have started dragging their feet on producing anything new, and they certainly weren't working on any diesels. In April of 1947, in order to deal with their losses, they actually merged with nearby General Machine Corporation of Hamilton, Ohio, and that formed the Lima Hamilton Corporation. They still were working on steam locomotives, and their last one was actually at the Nickel Plate Road, number 779, appropriately a 284 Berkshire. She's actually still in preservation in Lima, Ohio. And even with that, Lima still wasn't ready to give up on steam, believing they still could make headway in that market. Because the market still definitely, I promise you, totally exists now. Anyway, they're going to promote a new wheel arrangement, a 486. Yes, absolutely. It would allow for an even larger firebox than the 484s. No one wanted it. No one was interested. Not a single soul entertained the notion. Lima would never build a 486. Biting the bullet, Lima finally, in 1949, began building diesels, but it was way too late for that. Even in Baldwin's case, they had dabbled in diesels before, but Lima had barely touched diesels, so interestingly, they still kind of had it when it came to delivering quality products, as even though they were completely new to the diesel market, the 7 models they did wind up making, which totaled 175 individual locomotives, actually weren't that bad. They still had products that genuinely worked. They were just too late to make a dent in the market. Their line of switchers, well, some did sell. In fact, they sold 69 of their LS 1200s, which wasn't that bad. Their only model of road switchers only sold 16, the LRS 1200s, and they made one very large transfer unit, the LT 2500. 22 of those were built, and they were 2,500 horsepower. The fact that no sources mentioned these locomotives being difficult to operate suggests to me that Lima's diesels actually weren't that bad, they were just too late to the party. Even companies like Baldwin were struggling to find a niche in the new diesel market, dominated by EMD and soon General Electric. Alco was trying, but even they were struggling. There was no place for Lima at all, and in the grand scheme of things they really didn't sell any. But they also didn't have much time to produce and sell any, because of Baldwin. In 1951, Lima Hamilton merged with Baldwin to form Baldwin, Lima, and Hamilton, BLH. But even though Lima's diesels were actually pretty decent, the decision was made to discontinue their diesels entirely, in favor of Baldwin's instead. This was a dumb move, and I mentioned it's being really stupid when I talked about Baldwin, but I didn't really go into detail why, and I'm going to now. I can't fathom why this would have happened. Why did you merge if you were going to do this, is my serious, genuine question here. And the reason I bring this up is that I see no benefit to doing it that way. Because, well, you know, when it comes to a merger, 2 companies combine their assets into one corporation in an effort to make some headway in a market. Instead of competing with each other, they're working together. Okay, fine. But if you're going to just completely eliminate one of the mergee's entire catalog of products, then why merge at all? Especially in this case because, okay, you might say, well, Baldwin was eliminating a competitor. Were they? Because Lima was barely making any headway. Lima was so not their concern when it came to competition in any way. So that can't be the reason. It can't be space because Baldwin already had a massive shop complex that was in no way at capacity, so they didn't need Lima's shops for anything. Was it brand recognition? The Lima name? Well, that hadn't been doing Lima themselves any good, so why would they think that would change their woes? Do you see why this is dumb to me? Lima had decent diesels. You might as well expand your product line and say, well, we have Limas over here, and they're pretty decent. Why don't we try them? No, Baldwin was like, no, we're going to use ours, because ours are so much better. They really weren't, honestly, in the grand scheme of things, if I'm being blunt. But it's neither here nor there. It probably wouldn't have changed either company's fate by this point, because they both waited too long to really start working seriously on diesels. It didn't matter. And as I mentioned in my Baldwin video, BLH left the locomotive business entirely in 1956. For a time after that, the Clark Equipment Company actually manufactured Lima brand construction cranes in their old plant. Most of the company's records and builder's drawings have actually been transferred and are housed in the California State Railroad Museum's library in Sacramento, California. Lima was no more, mostly due to a staunch example of massive tunnel vision. Going back to the soda company metaphor again, well, consider this. Coke, Pepsi, and Dr. Pepper all have one thing in common beyond making soft drinks. They, don't just make one soft drink. They have many different flavors under their roster, many different kinds of products for all sorts of tastes. The problem that Baldwin and Lima had was they didn't diversify. They were focused so much on steam for so long, they didn't consider that it could ever possibly be replaced. Baldwin knew about diesels but got complacent and assumed that steam would stay forever. Lima seemed too fixated on improving steam to be better than diesels, rather than play it safe and start producing diesels of their own to stay competitive. Either way, it just didn't happen for either of them, and they both wound up going under, together in fact. Alco stood on their own, but even they failed, and they had a much better shot at it than the other two. But Lima, despite being in third place, well, for one, is still a very well-known and much beloved company. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I got so many comments on my Alco video about not mentioning Lima. Even though I was talking about Alco, the fact that I didn't mention Lima was one of their competitors was almost taken as an insult by some. I mean, come on guys, they were in third. I only had to talk about Baldwin to talk about Alco. But, I get your point. So, my bad. Additionally, many locomotives that were built by Lima are also still in preservation, and the thing about Lima is that many of theirs are some of the most famous locomotives in America. One of them is actually a Southern Pacific 4449, which is arguably one of, if not the most immediately recognizable locomotives in North America due to Southern Pacific's bright orange livery. She's often called Daylight because she's just a little ray of sunshine and everyone loves her. They also made Père Marquette 1225, who is a Berkshire, and the inspiration for the successful Polar Express, because whenever 1225's around, it's Christmas! Both because of her number, and because that's actually Christmas, 1225. In American date writing, we do the month first, so 1225 is literally Christmas. Literally Christmas! Merry Christmas! I could be here all day mentioning specific locomotives that were built by Lima, but the point is, their products are still around, and many are cared for by people that love them. And much like Baldwin and Alco, while Lima did fail eventually, they went down in history. And that in itself can be called a win. Not every company does that. Some fade into the background and are forgotten altogether. But not Lima. Also, they made Shays. And I love Shays. Look at the little funny gears. They're funny. They're great. I love these things. Thanks for the Shays, Lima! And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders. Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Pedro Kitsu 131 232, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Brian, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Hayden DeGrow, Master of None, Dr. Racer 78, Lord Hoth 444, Alaric Jaspers, The Baxter, That Guy with a Beard, Mark Holding, Lock Kraken, Crystal Morgan, A Person 723, DM Tribal Typhoon, Ohio Trucker 1, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Alfonso Lapuche, and Royal Hudson 2860. Till next time, this is Darkness and Abidwell Farfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfarfar